Good morning, everyone. Thank you. My name is Kayla Willis, and I am a student in Columbia University's Political Analytics program. And as a member of this program, I am constantly studying the role of media within political spaces. It's everywhere. And as we see it, we know that it impacts our lives in really unique ways. As someone who grew up in the digital age and unfortunately will have to continue to live in the digital age as I begin my professional career, I know that this conversation is extremely important. Today, we will dive into the process from data to headlines as we will converse deeply about the role of analytics in media and its coverage. The conversation that we all, whether a student like myself, a professional, or an active listener like you all, could benefit from. I'm honored to be introducing the individuals that sit before me today. We have Ms. Jennifer Augusta, the Director of Polling and Election Analytics at CNN.
You stretch it up.
Mr. Joe Linsky, the Executive Vice President at Edison Media Research. And Mr. Ethan Rosen, the Associate General Counsel at Predicted. This wonderful panel would be moderated by the incredible Dr. Basil Smikle, the Professor of Practice and Director of the Master of Science in Nonprofit Management program here at Columbia University School of Professional Studies.
Thank you.
I hope you all enjoy the conversation as much as I know I will. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Kayla, thank you very much. I've never seen anybody bring a congregation together outside the church as well as you just did. So thank you very much. Before we start, just to let everybody know, if you have a question about anything discussed today on this panel that you want to ask of the panelists, just raise your hand. We have somebody going around with the index card, as you know. We'll collect that and hopefully we get to ask your question as we get closer to the end of the hour. But we do have some slides that each of the panelists have provided. So I'm going to start to show them. Jennifer's is first, and then we can everybody will talk about each of their slides.
Hi. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the double haters. This is a group that we started really paying attention to in 2016. These are people who have an unfavorable view of both candidates for president in any given year. So unfavorable view of Hillary Clinton and unfavorable view of Donald Trump in 2016, and the same for Harris and Trump this year. So this is kind of the evolution of the distribution of this group over time, according to our exit polls. As you can see, in 2016, they were 18% of the total electorate. And that was kind of a stunning number when it first happened. We hadn't really seen anything like that before. And they were a pretty decisive group. They broke for the Republican by 17 points. Whereas, the people who have a favorable view of just one candidate and not the other, they're pretty locked in, as you can see, and that kind of holds across time. And we've gotten to a point now in 2024, we talked about them a little bit during the campaign when it was a Biden versus Trump race, but they kind of fell out of the conversation a bit once Harris took over the Democratic campaign. They made up 8% of all voters, ultimately, according to the exit poll, and they've broken Donald Trump's favor by 20 points. So an even bigger margin than they did in 2016. There's not really any sign in American politics that this type of voter is going away, right? We have most people who are fairly prominent in American politics have pretty crummy favorability ratings, and that seems unlikely to change, as we've seen in recent polling. But the other thing that I think is interesting about this group is how it has changed over time in terms of its composition. It's a little bit more male than female, according to the exit poll. 52% this year were male, 48% were female. But back in 2016, this group was 61% male. So it's becoming more like the overall population. This group is also very heavily independent. 70% identify themselves as political independents. Back in 2016, it was just 47% of the double haters who were independent. So that's kind of like a function of the growing polarization. They are twice as likely to be younger than 30 years old than the overall voting population is. So this is a pretty young, independent, more gender balanced group than it used to be. I also thought it was important to note that 73% within this group are casting a negative ballot. They say that their vote was against the opponent of the person they chose rather than in support of the candidate they actually voted for. Among all voters, that was 73% the other way, said that they were casting an affirmative ballot in support of their candidate. They are deeply dissatisfied with how things are going in the country. 89% of them had a negative reaction on or negative answer on how things are going. That was 73% among all voters. We're pretty negative generally. This is an exceptionally negative group. And they are less optimistic about the future. 51% say America's best days are ahead of it. That was 61% among all voters. So this really negative group is going to continue to be decisive. And I think that campaigns and media to some degree are going to have to figure out how to speak to these types of voters in order to win going forward.
Sure. Thank you. So, Joe, it's like this is
That's my
this
slide.
side.
Thank you. I hope everyone can read it. I tried to cram as much information as I could in one slide, but I think the important thing here is the exit poll, which we conduct for CNN and NBC and CBS, ABC, Washington Post, and Reuters, and other news organizations. We have a wealth of data in the exit poll. The exit polls have been conducted since the mid-1960s, and if you go to the Roper Center, you can get this information on how Black voters have voted, how Hispanic voters have voted. And what I'm looking at specifically here is the trend over the last 5 presidential elections of how Black and Hispanic voters have voted by political ideology. Because there's been a lot of talk and how Trump and the Republicans have made inroads among Black and Hispanic voters in 2020, and even more so in 2024, and where that came from. I took a look at how these voters self-identified in terms of political ideology. We've asked the question on the exit poll for more than 50 years, do you consider yourself a liberal, a moderate, or conservative? And what we saw is the movement, especially among Hispanics and even among Black conservatives, were by political ideology. In 2008, if you look back to Black voters, 2008, 2012, Barack Obama won over 80%, some cases 90% of Black voters, regardless of their political ideology, where they consider themselves conservative, moderate, or liberal. Black conservatives have moved towards Trump in the last 2 elections, so much so that he got over 40% of the vote, both in 2020 and 2024 among Black conservatives, but Black liberal and Black moderate voters have not moved and remain more than 90% Democratic. Hispanic voters have even trended more to the Republican, and we saw big jumps between 2016 and 2024 in conservative Hispanics becoming overwhelmingly Republican, but even moderate Hispanics becoming more Republican. Trump's vote among moderate Hispanics jumped from 21% in 2020 to 41% in 2024. And if you look at the top half of this chart, you see that ideology among these voters hasn't really changed. In 2008, when Obama won the first time, 28% of Blacks identify as liberal, and in 2024, 27% identify as liberal. Statistically, no change. And similarly, among conservatives, it went from 20% of Blacks saying they're conservative to 18% of Blacks saying they're conservative. And we see the same stability in these numbers among Hispanics. So what hasn't changed is political ideology among Black and Hispanics, but what has changed is the driver of their presidential vote. And what we saw in 2008, 2012 during the Obama elections was racial identity was much more the driver in presidential vote. But in 2020 and 2024, racial identity became less important, especially to conservative and moderate Black and Hispanic voters and how they voted. And as campaigns, and I know some of the campaign folks are here, I'm sure they've had to change their targeting to Blacks and Hispanics in terms of one message does not fit all now among these groups, and that especially Hispanics are looking a lot more like white voters when it comes to how their breakdown by liberal, moderate, conservative views affects their presidential choice.
Okay. Thank you. And Ethan.
Yeah, so what I have here is a predicted price chart of a market on who will win the 2024 Democratic nomination. For those of you who don't know, predicted is a real money market where you could trade on the outcome of political events such as elections or, in this case, a nomination. The red line is Joe Biden. The blue line is Kamala Harris. The market prices reflect odds, so an 85% chance that something's going to happen would be reflected by an 85-cent chart price. So if I could ask you to imagine that you'd never lived through the 2024 presidential election, which I think some of us might have hoped we could, if I told you that there was an incumbent president who was popular within his own party, unchallenged within his own party, running a re-election campaign and adamant that he was, going to be the nominee, and the convention is 2 months away, and I asked you, what are the odds that this person would be the nominee, this incumbent president? I'm guessing most of you tell me like 95%, 97%, close to 100%. But as you can see on the chart, as we're making our way through June, Joe Biden's odds are stuck between 80 and 85%, which means that the market is telling us that this is a really extraordinary situation. Kamala Harris, about 6%. There were some other people on the chart who I took off just so it would be a little easier to read. During this time period, this May to June time period, there are increasing videos coming out, reports that Joe Biden, he appears disoriented, he appears addled, but a lot of his friendly media, his campaign, the party is telling us everything is fine. These are cheap fakes. I made sure to include that because I love that one. This is a right-wing disinformation campaign. And then finally, the debate between Biden and Trump happens. You could see it on the chart. That's the inflection point. By that night, he's down to 60%. Kamala Harris starts to rise in the odds as it becomes clear she's going to be the nominee. You could see the market reflecting events as they occur. So Biden insists he's not going anywhere. His price starts to rise a little bit. Nancy Pelosi stabs him in the back on Morning Joe. His price drops again. He still insists he's not going anywhere. Then Chuck Schumer comes in, hits him over the head with a baseball bat, tells him it's time to leave the race, and his price collapses to the floor, never recovers. Kamala Harris, of course, becomes the nominee, and Joe Biden does not. Incentives matter, and this is a point I want to make clear, because a lot of us, including myself, are concerned about the extent to which the incentive structures in society now, a lot of them in media or in politics, reward groupthink. They reward circling the wagons by incentive structures. I'm sure a lot of you can think of them, but the need to raise money, the fear of social ostracization, or the fear of not being booked on television, likes and retweets on social media. We did things a little differently. We incentivize people financially to be correct, because if you're right, your shares resolve at $1. If you're wrong, they resolve at 0, and you're sad like Joe Biden is in that picture. These incentive structures matter. And what I hope is that markets like this continue to, tell us that maybe some of the conventional wisdoms are right, maybe some of them are wrong, but in any case, they help us to sort through a world dominated by partisanship and groupthink.
Well, thank you. I want to get into some questions. I actually should make two disclosures. First, I am a political analyst for MSNBC, so I'm on that side. And I used to be the executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. So if you hear me lean into the left a little bit, please excuse me. So I'm just saying that those squiggly lines towards the end, that was a tough couple of weeks for a good number of us. Thank you. One of the things, so I actually want to my first question to be is sort of a zoom out question. You all brought some incredibly important data today. Are folks in the media good at talking about it? Are they good at being able to inform the public about the kind of data that you're bringing to us today?
Well, I know an expert right here. So she should go first.
Well, I think that yes and no. I think that there are a good number of people within media, particularly in an election year, who get very hung up on one specific data point, and that is the horse race and where it stands. But I think if you're just covering the horse race and you're not bringing in all the other pieces of information that are important that go along with it, you're not really giving the clear and complete picture of what's happening. And I think we try very hard to make sure that we do that within our coverage at CNN. And I think there are other media outlets that are doing that as well. It's always a challenge because that horse race number and who's ahead and who's behind is always what sort of people are the most interested in. And so it gets a lot of clicks and it becomes a very interesting data point for readers and viewers. But I mean, really, without the context, it really doesn't tell you very much, which I think is what our first panel told us as well. So it's a bit of a struggle, and it's hard to sometimes convey the full breadth of what we mean when we talk about data within something like a TV graphic or even an online presentation. But I think we are making progress on that, getting better at that every single time we try to do it.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of data out there. I mean, I just showed one slide from the exit poll that's tens of thousands of interviews conducted every 4 years, nationally going back 50 years. And yet what I showed had not, I didn't see on CNN. I didn't see on any of the networks because there's a limitation in time and space in terms of presenting. In fact, the data I showed, I didn't see anyone else show that data until last week. David Shore did a podcast with Abs Are Crying with similar data on breakout of Black and Hispanic voters, and his data, separate source, matched our data almost exactly. I think also, if the media doesn't pick it up, there tends to be, I think, as Ethan said, kind of a groupthink. And I look back, I was going to show some data from our 2022 midterm exit poll about, it was a decent enough showing for the Democrats, but in the exit poll, there was very clear information that Joe Biden's ratings were in the tank. He was in the low 40s. No presidential, no party has ever won when their incumbent president was below 45%. And yet that data was ignored by the party and by the Biden campaign. The only reason the Democrats even came close to winning the House and held on in the Senate in 2022 is because almost half the voters who said they somewhat disapprove of Joe Biden voted for a Democratic House candidate or a Democratic Senate candidate. And that data seemed to be ignored by the Democratic Party in terms of wishing that away. To expect that Joe Biden could run again and half the people that somewhat disapprove of him would still vote for him for president seems to have been a bit of a folly. So I think there's a lot of data, but if parties and media aren't willing to look under the hood to find data points that might go against their narrative, they're not going to report that data.
Right.
Yeah, I completely agree with Joe on that. One thing I'll add to this is that not only is there more data than ever before, but there's actually really good analysis out there. Like you could go to the Upshot on the New York Times, which did really good polling and talked about a lot of these things. I don't know how much that proliferated into cable news. I don't watch cable news, so I don't know. But it's there if you want to find it. I think that there are really good questions about why so many prominent people ignore it.
Yeah. Well, I want to kind of pick up on that point and point you made, Joe, based on something Kayla said. You know, there's a whole generation that's growing up in social media that doesn't watch cable news, right? But there's also this challenge with not just getting good data out there, but correcting misinformation and disinformation. So how do we do that? How do we break through that? Because if I don't even know if there is as much of a stomach for, I think there was, and maybe it's changing for sort of in real time fact checking, which you can't really do in social media. So how do we sort through good data from bad? But there's a way.
And that Yeah, if people knew the answer to that question. I think it is tough because there aren't big communal sources of information anymore. The network news, which was the main way people got their information of the day 30, 40 years ago, is not as relevant in most people's lives. Definitely most people under the age of 65 or 60. At the same time, the media that's replaced it is very scattered, and you can pick and choose the data sources you want, and that leads to, I think, this compounding of people self-select the media sources they want, and those media sources self-select the data that supports their point of view, and that means it's hard for an individual viewer to find pieces of data that don't fit with their worldview, and I think that is part of the polarization process that's going on.
And what?
I mean, that's definitely part of it. What you're served on social media is clearly a part of the issue. But I think that media organizations like CNN, we're talking about watching cable news. CNN's not just a cable news company. We have one of the most visited websites in the entire world where people go and read our journalism. One of the things that I did this year that probably got more views than my average poll story was a TikTok video explaining how we make decision desk projections. These things exist, and we're in those spaces and trying to communicate with the same standards that we uphold when we're reporting something on TV. So I think the more sort of good actors that are in that space and providing that content in ways that are accessible and interesting to the audiences in those places. Like, we can't just dump a cable news story on a TikTok video, right? We have to adapt to what we're doing to make it work there. And I think that that's something that most major media are really engaging in right now and trying to, as a way to solve this problem, not just for data, but for all the information that we share.
Well, let's do an informal poll if you don't mind, because I actually do this with all my classes that we're doing here. We're going to be a little interactive today. How many of you regularly, a couple of nights a week, watch network news? Right. Cable news, Fox, CNN, MSNBC. So where do you get your news? TikTok? Instagram, Facebook, Twitter? Podcasts. How many of you podcasts? Yeah, look at that. Wow. And how many of you go to a print news site like the Times, Daily News regularly? Well, there you go. Friends? But no. So,
University.
huh?
Here is university, so it makes sense that people go to the paper outside civil society American.
Well, I don't know. I'm sometimes surprised because there are a lot of students that don't necessarily go to the New York Times or Wall Street Journal site, but they may pick up some of the reporters that are doing a podcast because they can do a deeper dive, right?
I think there's also there's a challenge in how we talk about news,
yeah.
right? Like, people, when you ask them where they get their news, they think about very specific things. But there was this Pew study a few years back where they had access to people's actual Twitter accounts and like who they followed and what they were looking at. And like half of the people who said that they didn't get news on Twitter were following journalists, were following news organizations. So like, yes, you're getting news on Twitter if you're following those people. You just may not necessarily think of it that way.
And
Well,
go ahead.
you mentioned podcasting. There was quite a few hands that went up, and the other half of our business, not election business, is media research. And we at Edison produce quarterly reports of podcast listening, and though that data is used by campaigns to decide where to place their candidates, which shows to put their candidates on. And we did an analysis after the fact. And in terms of audience reach through podcasting, the Trump campaign did a much better job of reaching a larger audience through podcasting than the Kamala Harris campaign. It was almost 4-1, the number of weekly podcast listeners that listened to podcasts that Trump appeared on versus ones that Kamala Harris appeared on.
Actually, go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing I want to jump in on. on our website, we notice very large spikes in traffic that are disproportionate to the amount of people trading during major times like elections or like that whole period where Biden seemed on the ropes. Somebody on the previous panel mentioned Gen Z has an 8-second attention span, apparently. But on our website, you press the odds, 75% chance, that takes 1 second, which tells us that there is a real hunger for these odds, especially on election night as things come in and things seem certain. And people don't necessarily want to sit through, a CNN or MSNBC or Fox News panel for an hour to get a bottom line. They want 1 second, 75% done.
And I actually want to go back to tie that into the podcast comment, because there was I think a Media Matters report that tied to a Pew study. The Pew study said that the majority of a lot of young voters got their news from so-called news influencers that trended both male and conservative. And 77% of them were not tied to a specific news organization, however that's defined. And then the Media Matters report, a couple of weeks ago maybe, that said that not only is sort of the social media and podcast space dominated by white men, but conservatives, there's more conservative talk in that sphere, but it's not just politics, it's also comedy, it's also sports. So how do we think about politics being discussed in all of these different spaces, or at least some kind of political speak being engaged in all these different spaces?
Is that politics is, before media, before radio, before it was discussed in the town square. It was discussed in other communal settings. It wasn't discussed with necessarily professional journalists or necessarily other politicians. So I don't think that's a bad thing for politics to be discussed in non-political places. And in fact, I think the campaigns that are navigating this space better have realized that they don't need to be on a show that's 100% political talk to expose their candidate or their ideas to the public. Now, we've been measuring podcasts for over a decade, and podcasting originally skewed more Democratic. In the past couple of years, the Republicans have caught up, but there are as many Democrats listening to podcasts every week as Republicans. There just seems to be more specific shows that cater specifically to conservative talk, but there's plenty of Democrats in the audience of podcasting that would listen to that type of appeal.
And you mentioned this earlier, but if you talk a little bit about how CNN sort of diversifies where they are, not just website and television, but also other ways in which they sort of reach the voter with data.
Yeah, we are actively seeking to be on all platforms available to us. And I think that's anyone who would want to survive within the news environment that we live in right now really needs to be sort of across all of those spaces. And they require different resources and different approaches, but you can present your data in all of these formats. They're not limiting, and you're not sort of boxed out of one or the other just because of the way it looks. Like we have people who know how to make things look really fun and catchy on TikTok, and they can make my poll data look right there, So I think it really is just being there and being available to people in whatever ways they're willing to meet you.
Also, in terms of the attention span, the most listened to podcast in America is the Joe Rogan Experience.
Yeah.
And his average podcast length can sometimes be 3 hours long. So yes, there is potentially the 8-second attention span to certain things, but in certain entertaining environments, people will invest a large amount of time to conversation.
Now, you mentioned the decision desk, and I want to talk a little bit about what happens on election night. 2016, I was running the state party. I was at the Javits Center until about 3 o'clock in the morning. I still have my tear-stained jacket from that night. How has election night, decision desk, how does that changed over the years? whether it's before or whether before 2016 or if 2016 was a sort of a milestone year?
Yeah, it's gotten a lot more complicated. The pieces of data that you need to have to be able to understand what you're looking at as votes are coming in are much more complicated and complex. There's a ton more that you can actually know before election night that we never would have known, even in 2016. That we know how many votes were cast in different places. We know in the early vote in places with party registration, what that registration breakdown looks like, how that compares to past years, what the geographic distribution is of early votes and absentee votes. And all of that goes into our calculation and understanding. It's not like we walk in on election morning with no idea of what's coming at us throughout the day. And that, I think, has been an improvement. It also makes it much more complicated to present it on election night and really convey to our viewers and our readers what we're looking at and what we're seeing. You don't want to overstate your confidence in something that could still change, but you also don't necessarily want to act like you don't know anything when you do. So it's a much more delicate balance, I think, than it used to be, where it was sort of like, okay, we're going to wait and see what happens. But now we really can sort of say, this is what we know so far. Here are the pieces that we don't know, why we don't know them, and we can really present that in a very database, fact-based way.
And the process starts earlier because people start voting now weeks before election day. It goes later because certain states take forever to count their votes. I'm looking at you, California. So it's not just election day in terms of how people are voting. It's weeks of voting up until election day. That's the end of actual voting, but it's also days of reporting of voting, and there'll be races. We didn't call, even though we called the presidential race in the wee hours of the morning.
This one, 2024.
In 2024, the House races took over a week to get to know who was going to control the House. Now, as the old man on this panel, I have a little experience to date myself. My first election was in 1988. I was working at CBS News, and the amount of attention now paid to election night is just infinitely more than it was in 1988. 1988, we watched the broadcast that night. Each of the networks made their calls, and then by the next day, it moved on. If you go back, you'll find there's a guy on Twitter that shows clips from previous election nights, and occasionally he'll pop up a clip from 1988. We called Illinois wrong at CBS in 1988. NBC and ABC called Maryland wrong in 1988. No one remembers that because no one cared then. After Florida in 2000, if the networks make a mistake, all hell would break loose. And I'm proud to say, since 2000, no network has miscalled a statewide election for president, senator, governor since Florida 2000, which wasn't the case beforehand. I think that's because there's so much more attention on it and so much more thought and resources put behind the decisions we make on election night.
I think one election night thing that's a little bit different now than it used to be is the partisanship of the different vote methods, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. You would expect early absentee to be the most democratic. Markets like ours have actually gotten really good at reflecting this, so people understand what the different vote type is, and I know that there's all the people on the decision desks do as well. I would actually, if I could give a recommendation to the decision desks, they should be willing, or their models are producing statistics and odds. If they should give those to people, because if people see that, Ohio, Kamala Harris has 53% of the vote, but the decision desk thinks she's almost certain to lose it, they should say that, and they should explain it.
We got quite a few questions here, and actually, in time, for the time that we have remaining, I do want to try to get to as many as possible. Do pollsters view prediction markets as threats?
As threats?
Yes.
I think it's a completely different way to measure sentiment. The audience of people who are using a prediction market is not the general public, right? It's a group of people who have informed opinions about whatever it is they're putting their money behind. And it may ultimately wind up matching what you see in the polls, and there's very much a chicken and an egg question here, right? Like of what's driving what. But what we do as pollsters is about reflecting the voices of people who wouldn't necessarily otherwise get those voices out there, right? Like we talk to people who have no idea what a prediction market is, and they do take our surveys, and we know they're there. And I think that we are just reflecting something that's a little bit different. We also will always be, I think, the best way to get into policy positions and issue views and things that are not just this thing will happen or it won't, right? It's not necessarily about being predictive. It's about understanding what people need and want in their own lives, which you can't always measure with market. It's just a different medium.
And predictive market is a certain type of game. Yes, it's the game of predicting, but then there's an actual game. So we did the prediction market of the Falcons Patriots Super Bowl, where the Falcons were up 28-3. The prediction market would say one thing, and the end result was a different thing. That's why they still play the game. It doesn't mean the market wasn't informed in making its best guess, but it meant the outcome of the field might not actually reflect what the predictions say.
Yeah, and I would just add to that in terms of prediction markets on elections, polls are probably, up until the actual election results come in, polls are probably the single biggest piece of information driving them. And you can actually see, like, polls will come out and they'll actually move the markets almost immediately. Sometimes, correctly, sometimes not, in the case of, like that Seltzer poll. Yeah, it's a symbiotic relationship, and I hope we don't scare them away from conducting polls. That would be bad for everybody.
Well, and I think this is you did, the criticism of the predictive market and how it involves money. Does it demean the political process?
I mean, there's so much money in politics. I think that going after prediction markets for demeaning the political process is like missing the point. I mean, Elon Musk spent $200 million in this last election. I don't think a single person on our market, we're currently capped at $850. I know there are others that have bigger caps, but $200 million is a lot of money. This is a drop in the bucket compared to that. And that's a drop in the bucket compared to the billions of dollars that are spent on presidential elections.
But how do you there's certain items on your predictive market that are decisions, like Joe Biden running again.
Yeah.
That's basically one person's decision. How do you make sure that individual decisions like that aren't manipulated in your marketplace?
So there are laws that prevent, certain interested parties from trading on the outcome of events. But in that particular case, I would just say that I just don't think it's realistic that Joe Biden, and I know this is the most extreme example, but that Joe Biden is going to decline to run for, the presidency, or that somebody's going to throw a Senate race in order to win a small dollar trade. I don't think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Speaking of Joe Biden, I don't know who this is directing to specifically, but you mentioned Joe Biden's favorability rating in 2024, but Kamala Harris's rating as VP was lower in the high 30s. In the exuberance of her candidacy, this seemed to have been completely forgotten in the media coverage. Why was this data overlooked? What was it?
I don't think it was overlooked. There were plenty of, I know 538 did stuff, Real Clear Politics did stuff, was in our exit poll. I think there was quite a bit of movement in terms of Kamala Harris's favorability number during the campaign, and then a little bit of erosion towards the end. So I think actually all that was covered. And the fact was that even though at the point Biden left, Kamala Harris's favorability number might have been a few points below Biden at that point, it was, by the time she became the nominee, her favorability number was way higher than Biden's had been for years.
It's an interesting question because we talked about how we consume media. This question is about whether or not anything's changed since November in terms of how we consume media.
How we consume media. Oh, goodness. I feel like it's a very short time period, so there's not a ton of change, I think, in that time.
Well, my sense is, part of the genesis of the question maybe, that there are so many folks that said, well, I'm done. I'm tuning out.
Yeah.
And if you've noticed that, has that impacted any of your work, or have you seen it in your numbers? If that's the case.
I think yes, that makes some sense. There was definitely like a tune-out factor shortly after the election. But I think you're seeing in some of the polling among Democratic-leaning independents now, that there is increasingly attention to what's happening, to what's going on, and desire for stronger response from their own partisans. And I think that sort of portends a bit of a like check back in process. And we may be seeing that to some degree in some of the special elections that have already come up. I mean, there is the built-in advantage that Molly talked about that Democrats have because the electorate in a special election is a more educated, in today's politics, more Democratic-leaning group. But, if we continue to see those trends across special elections throughout this year, that may be an indication that the Democrats really are checking back into politics in a meaningful way.
Yeah, we did see in our podcast audience numbers certain Democratic-leaning podcasts lessen right after the election, but I think most of it is kicked back in.
Yeah, I think a couple of things on that. One, I think that prediction markets have actually attracted a lot more attention since the election because there was a sense that, some of the media, the straight reporting on it was maybe off base a little bit more than the prediction markets were. But in terms of tuning out, this is just my own prediction, but I think that on the Democratic side, I think a lot of people have lost trust in their own establishment media, so like MSNBC and CNN, and because it didn't really help them navigate through the election period, and maybe they felt misinformed. And I think you're going to see a lot more going to podcasts, a lot more going to social media, to people who kind of reflect their ire at the establishment in general.
Actually, let me ask the follow-up. Does that suggest that Fox News was more on target with their voter, or their voter, let me say it differently, that voter believes in Fox News more in terms of giving them good information, correct information, or at least information that they find to be useful?
That's a scary thought. Yeah. I mean, I've seen numbers on this. I'm sure you all have as well. I don't think Fox News did experience the same drop-offs that MSNBC and CNN did. So I think maybe that does tell you that people, they think Sean Hannity and The Five and Greg Gutfeld are telling them the truth, whether that's true, But that's what they believe.
Okay. One thing that drives Gen Z, younger millennials to alternative forms of news media is the ability to, quote, hide their political ideology. How could this impact data within the upcoming elections, or even at all? Do you find that to be the case a lot?
What you mean by you can just make it less apparent in their...
Could be maybe less apparent, or, there's always the Tom Bradley effect? Sort of not telling pollsters the truth, or somehow manipulating.
I've been doing this for 36 years. It's respondents don't lie to us. They're much more likely to hang up the phone on us and not want to talk to us. But there's very few of them that lie to us or feel afraid to express their opinion. I don't think people ever think MAGA supporters are afraid to share.
Well, actually, I was going to ask you the other side of that question. Do you feel that there are people that are a lot more willing to want to express their views to opposed to it?
And there are there's been studies on this, and there's certain types of voters that are more likely to participate in a survey, and there are ones that are more likely to vote, more likely to talk about politics with their friends, more likely to be active in campaigns. So the people we talk to tend to be more active. So you've got to be careful to include people that are less enthused but are still going to participate in the electoral process and make sure they're included.
Okay.
And to add to that, to adjust for those things in your results, the same way you would adjust for differentials in race or age or gender. You have to have some benchmark that you're using to account for that in some way.
For Jennifer, this is based on your slide. For the double haters, what are the core issues that made them that disagree with both parties? if you could say.
Unfortunately, we didn't really have that many issue questions on the exit poll where we asked the favorability ratings. So I can't really do that crosstab super well. But I mean, I think that the biggest driving issue is the overall negativity. I mean, clearly, they are just deeply disappointed with the leadership that they were getting from Washington in this moment. I mean, more than 80% saying that things in the country were going the wrong way. That's huge. That is dissatisfaction with everything. I can't say that that is connected to one specific issue, but that is deep negativity of a kind that we don't often see from people who were actually turning up to vote. These are people who voted, not people who checked out, but people who came to the polls to express that negativity through their vote. So I think it's not one thing. It's the deep dissatisfaction with Washington that has been driving so much of American politics in the last, decade, really.
It's even further than that. This is a long-term trend. I mean, again, if you want to look at the exit polls, you can go to the Roper Center and go back to 1972. Look, until just recently, it was rare when either candidate had a favorable under 50%. Now, since 2016, both candidates have had unfavorables under 50%, both in 2016 and 2024. So this is a long-term trend in the decrease in favorable ratings for the presidential candidates going back a long way.
Well, yeah, I have actually kind of a question about the double haters. I mean, are these people who are more likely to listen to these kind of non-news but kind of news sources like Joe Rogan or, I mean, those types of podcasts? Because it seems like these people do not want to be preached to.
Did you write this question? Because this question is,
I did not write it.
How do you
no.
consider facially apolitical content like Rogan that still has a political valence when calculating partisanship of media consumption? So,
I mean, just to put a little bit of a step back on this, it's not like politicians going to non-political media is a brand new thing in this election, right? I'm going to date myself a little bit. Bill Clinton went on the Arsenio Hall show and played a saxophone,
I remember
right?
that night. I remember that night.
happened. And
I love that night.
It was like this huge thing,
I remember
right?
that night.
Barack Obama sat down with Zach Galifianakis on Between Two Ferns, right? This is not brand new. It's not brand new.
I can go even further.
You can go even further
Richard
back.
Nixon went on laughing.
There you
in
go.
1968. So like this.
I mean, I think political figures know that they have to reach people in other places, and it's not like there's some magical formula of exactly which things are going to be the ones that break through. It's partly about the candidate, right? Like, it's about your ability to capture people's opinions, and the rise of the double haters suggests that the political figures that we have right now are not capturing the imagination of the American public in the way that political figures used to.
Is it an anger toward both parties, just sort of equally? Or is it just the people that the parties are promoting that they don't particularly like?
I mean,
Or is it one of them?
I think we're still figuring out the answers to that.
Yeah, although
But
if you look at the latest numbers on the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, both parties fare pretty poorly in public opinion polls.
One question that I have, and it's going to, when you were talking about black voters earlier, there was a period of time, I guess in the late summer, fall, when we were spending a lot of time talking about black men in particular. Do you feel that if you think about that moment in time specifically, but also in the ways that the media talks about the intersection of race and political ideology, is it, are we actually doing it justice? Or is it a lot more nuanced than, and I think I know the answer to this, but is it a lot more nuanced than we've been discussing, and how has that really sort of hurt the overall conversation about what our parties look like and coalition building and so on?
Obviously, there's a lot more nuance, and it's obvious that the Democratic message towards black and Hispanic voters, while still winning vast numbers of black voters and a majority of Hispanic voters, one was less appealing than it was 8, 12, 16 years ago. So obviously, none of these ethnic groups is a monolith. We've heard that about Hispanic voters for years. You know, there's differences between Cuban voters in South Florida and Mexican voters in Texas, et cetera. But there's also differences within the African American community. And I think there was a period of time where, frankly, Republicans didn't message at all to black voters, and Democrats had that feel to themselves. Now that Trump and his campaign have at least figured out ways to make inroads among certain groups, whether it's conservative black voters or young black males, there's more of a debate there, and I think hopefully the communication will be more nuanced in the future.
It was a tough summer. It was a tough summer. How much time do we have? We have 10 minutes. There we go. Couple of other quick questions. So see here the main sources of information from large tech, Google searches, TikTok, Spotify, and podcasts. Is there a power ranking among them? Should we be worried at all about the influence of, I guess, search engines? And we talked about social media before, but given the Elon Musk and because you talked about Elon Musk's influence on government and Facebook and so on, you know, how much should we be worried about their influence on politics going forward, or have we gotten smarter to it or about it?
No, I'll take it. I don't think we've gotten smarter to it, and I think we should be worried. I think that, I mean, if you look at Twitter today, if you go to the algorithmically generated, you know, front page, it's a lot of stuff that's designed to get you outraged and to say, oh, all these leftists are really destroying this country. They're doing terrible things. And it's easy to say, oh, well, that doesn't affect me. I'm smarter than that. I have higher order thinking. But the pretty explicit goal of this is just hammered into your head day after day after day and soften you up to it. So, I mean, yeah, I think you should be worried about it, especially like, if the average person now, how much time are they spending on their phones, on TikTok, on YouTube, on especially YouTube Shorts, these kind of short form things? You're not even realizing its ability to drill into your head. And then I think if you took a lot of people 2 years ago versus today and you had them have a conversation, you know, with their old self, they would find that their views on social issues have evolved as their content they've taken in has evolved.
Yeah, and I think what you said, it's the time. The time we spend with different media has changed dramatically in the last 10 to 20 years. And how much time people spend with that phone and individually directed media as opposed to more communal media, whether it's cable or network broadcast or whatever. The time shift there has been dramatic over the last 20 years.
I do want to sort of take this from a little bit of a different perspective. We did a project at CNN with some researchers from Georgetown and Michigan, where every week from just before the June debate through the election, we asked people what you have seen, read, or heard about the candidates, open-ended, anything you wanted to say in recent days. And coding that over the course of the summer, as the Harris campaign kicked up and through November, the thing that was most notable in what people were seeing, hearing, and reading, we didn't ask them where they saw it, just generally. What have you heard? The words that people used to talk about what they had heard about the Kamala Harris campaign were mostly about campaign events. She's at a rally. She's up in the polls. She's doing this or that. But it was almost never about the substance of what was happening within those events. And that was markedly different from what we saw in how people answered that question about Donald Trump. And so that speaks to not necessarily how people are getting their media, but what they're getting out of it. It was just a very different takeaway for people as they were hearing whatever it was about Kamala Harris versus whatever it was they were hearing about Donald Trump.
Well, this might be the last question. How can experts better communicate complex topics like probability and uncertainty? In both 2022 and 2024, pollsters were fairly happy with their performance overall, but the media narrative was that polling failed.
I've thought about this so much. So I spent so much time considering how we can possibly convey uncertainty without also saying we don't trust our data. It's sort of a problem. But we have to be realistic about what our data can do. Every poll that I do comes with an error margin that is not even half the size it probably should be to reflect the real world error in data collection and estimation of what those numbers are. We've started at CNN, we started this before 2020, putting a label on any poll result we show that's within the margin of error that says there's no clear leader in the race, right? If we have a Trump +3 or Harris +2, it says no clear leader right there at the top in big letters, and it's bright yellow, so you can't possibly miss it. And that's helped a little bit, but it's still really hard for people conceptually to see 48 versus 46 and not think 48 is bigger. Like definitively it's bigger. So my colleagues at some newspapers have started putting little error bars around their graphics, their bar charts. I'm not sure that necessarily helps. And on TV, that's even harder. So this is like one of our biggest challenges within the polling world in trying to figure out how we can talk about uncertainty and what we feel we know. I mean, every single opportunity that I had to report on poll results in 2024, I said, this is close. This is close. Even when I had something slightly outside of the error margin, it's a narrow lead, right? Like nothing was indicating blowout here. So I think you just have to be as repetitive as you can. And maybe there are different words or presentations that we will come up with at some point, but it is a huge challenge for our industry.
And Joe, to your point, maybe there's competition for the viewer, right? Because you have the station doing a poll, let's say CNN in this case, but then you have the campaigns coming out and saying, well, that's not true, or here's our poll that says something different.
Well, and there's also this desire. We're talking about data here today, right. And everyone thinks data is precise. It's a number. I'll tell you a story from 2004. Our national exit poll had George W. Bush winning 44% of the Hispanic vote. We also did 50 state surveys. We averaged those 50 state surveys up. He got 40% of the vote. Back then, the LA Times did their own exit poll. They had 45% of the Hispanic vote going for Bush. Pew did a post-election research survey. They had 43%. I had journalists calling me all the time. Says, we want to know the Hispanic number that voted for Bush. And I said, well, there's 4 different sources. Our 2 sources said 44 and 40. LA Times said 45. Pew said 43. But you don't understand. I need the number. I'm giving you the number. There's different ways to measure it. There's different ways of different margins of error. Data isn't always a number. It is either a range of numbers or a number with a certain amount of imprecision, and that's what we have to better communicate. And it's tough because audiences want those numbers, journalists want those numbers. They want a precision. They're used to numbers with precision, where it's the score of a sporting event or the stock market or whether there's a number. That's not what we're measuring.
Yeah, and on that note, one of the things that I'm sure some of you have seen is, if a market or a probability, a model says that somebody has a 55% chance of winning. People on their side go, oh my God, we're going to win. It's certain, 55% chance is the same thing as 45% chance as far as your brain can comprehend it. A lot of people have tried to come up with ways of illustrating this, like, oh, this is the odds that, somebody hits a home run, or this is the chance that it snows on Christmas in Milwaukee or something like that. One of the best I've seen, I think it was from Split Ticket. It was just a box that had 100 circles, 55 of them were red, 45 of them were blue, and said, guess which one is the 55, guess which one's the 45. And you immediately recognize it's impossible, can't do it, these are the same things. So I think there are ways in which, we could show the data better, but it's tough because people want to know what the future is going to hold, and people don't like uncertainty. It's a demand problem as much as anything.
All right, last point from all of you, if you can say, the students in the room, what should they be thinking about looking at going forward? Give them some hope or some marching orders, one or two. And Ethan, if you can, for me, can you predict whether or not the Cowboys are going to win next year? Sorry for all the Eagles fans, but
I would say to the students, I feel like this is a moment where you, as a person who knows how to work with data and can understand what it's telling you, have an incredible launching pad for your career. if you are able to work with that data and to be able to translate it into understandable and actionable insights for any part of the world, you are going to be just fine. Like, this is going to be the currency of our world and society going forward, is being able to understand data, what it means and what it can do. So you can translate these skills to selling toothpaste just as easily as you can to selling a candidate. So you're all good.
I couldn't have said that better. And you now have more tools than you ever had before to communicate that, whether it's technological tools or media. I mean, anyone can start their own podcast. Anyone can start their own YouTube channel. Just a matter of creating content that's compelling for people to consume. And we know there's desire out there for the type of data we create.
No?
Yeah, I would just say pay attention to the data, but also pay attention in how you're talking to people and how you're trying to convince people. I think taking a 60 side of a 60-40 issue, sometimes it's great, but sometimes taking a 40 side and communicating it clearly and with conviction is going to work out better than just chasing what's popular all the time. I think there's a big disconnect between, the educated class right now and people who aren't, and it's not just in what they believe, but it's in how they talk, and it's a big problem in our society right now.
So thanks for some great words of wisdom, Jennifer, Joe, and Ethan. Appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.